Hello and good evening from Ottawa. Good afternoon to those of you who are on the West Coast, and good evening to the rest of you across the country. My name is Sean McCarthy. I'm Vice President of World Press Freedom Canada. We're a volunteer committee that advocates on behalf of press freedom in Canada and abroad. Citizens' right to government information is a core tenet of democracy. So it's appropriate that we're holding this debate in the last week of the federal election. For journalists, freedom of information is a key ingredient to hold to account those in power. But like all rights, it's not absolute. Tonight, we have two debaters who will give their views on the proper functioning of the Federal Access to Information Law. This is a nonpartisan event. Parties of every stripe, both federally and provincially, have open government on the campaign trail, have committed to open government on their campaign trail, only to fall short of promises when they form government. So I'd like to introduce our two debaters. Michael Wernick is a senior strategic advisor at MNP Limited and a fellow at the Carleton School of Public Policy and Administration. Michael has had a 38-year public service career culminating in serving as Canada's 23rd clerk of the Privy Council from 2016 to 2019. He has a book coming out, Governing Canada, a guide to the tradecraft of politics, that will be released by UBC Press in October. Sean Holman is an award-winning investigative reporter and a journalism prof. He is recently named University of Victoria's Wayne Crooks Professor in Environmental and Climate Journalism. So congratulations on that move, Sean. He is a Freedom of Information researcher and founding editor of The Public Eye, a former syndicated columnist, talk show host, and legislative reporter. He produced and directed the documentary Whipped, The Secret World of Party Discipline. Our moderator tonight is Heather Bakken. She's the publisher and vice president for business development for iPolitics, who is our host tonight. And Heather is also president of World Press Freedom Canada. I want to thank our sponsors, our partner, our longstanding partner, the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, and our major sponsor, the Canadian Bankers Association. Before we kick off the debate, we're going to show a short video in which leading journalists talk about the importance of access to information in their work, and then it's over to Heather. Thanks very much and enjoy the evening.
The Access to Information Act is a vital tool used by journalists to hold governments to account. It's also used extensively by civil society, by academics, by business, and by ordinary Canadians. The law is essentially frozen in time. It was passed in 1982, long before the internet and the digital age. It has never been overhauled since. Users say the law is broken, and that's just the way governments want it. Before today's debate, we wanted to share with you the experiences of 4 top journalists using access to information.
Hi, I'm Sarah Cox. I'm an investigative reporter for the Narwhal and co-winner of this year's Press Freedom Prize. My article could never have been written without access to information legislation. The BC government withheld key information about a troubled, publicly funded hydro dam, and the public only became aware of significant issues through our investigation. Yet there's still major shortcomings with access to information legislation across the country. It takes far too long to get information, in some cases years, and far too long to appeal redactions.
Hello, I'm David Puglisi, reporter for the Ottawa Citizen and winner of the World Press Freedom Canada's 2020 Spencer Moore Award for Lifetime Service. Documents obtained using the Federal Access to Information System play an instrumental role in my reporting. For instance, over the last year, I used the Access Law to obtain records that showed military personnel spied on the Black Lives Matter movement. We need changes to the Access Law to make it easier to obtain documents. And we need a system that has real consequences for the bureaucrats and politicians that try to prevent the release of documents.
I'm Mike D'Souza, managing editor of the Narwhal. A few years ago, I used access to information legislation to uncover a conflict of interest in a major federal pipeline project review. But sadly, in a lot of cases, governments use laws to hide information about what they are doing and what they know. Our laws need some more teeth when it comes to access. We need to remove exceptions and excuses that officials use to censor information and delay, and we need more transparency.
Hi, I'm Justin Ling. I'm a freelance journalist and all-around access to information nerd. I genuinely don't think I'd have a career without the Access to Information Act. I've relied on it for hundreds of stories, and also I think I would have quit journalism if I couldn't rely on it to ferret out government information. But genuinely, I'm concerned about the future of the Act. The last 10 years has seen a precipitous decline in the quality of our access to information system, and if we don't do something really soon, we're going to lose the right of access altogether. In particular, the government has become really good at covering up national security information by weaponizing the exemptions and the delays baked into the Act, and if we don't do something soon, things are going to get a whole lot worse. So for the love of God, people, please call for improvements to the Access to Information Act and don't take no for an answer.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for tonight's debate, World Press Freedoms, Access to Information Debate. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Dean, very much. I'm Heather Bakken, by the way, your moderator, as Sean mentioned. I'll be sharing the rules of engagement and trying to keep everyone to time and the trains moving during this debate this evening. First, the rules of engagement. We will not be having any points of personal privilege, points of order, or a cross-exam in this debate. It will simply be a straight up 10 minutes for the affirmative, 10 minutes for the negative. Then we'll switch into the rebuttal phase. There will be 5 and 5 on the rebuttal, and then a second set of rebuttal, which we call the closing statements, and no new evidence may be introduced in the closing statements. We have some housekeeping notes for all of you who are joining us virtually. There is, if you're having an issue with your bandwidth, please click on there's a button called click here to switch stream. It will reduce the bandwidth, take you to audio, so at least you'll be able to hear and engage in the debate. Of course, we have a question and answer after the debate. We'd like you to be engaged. This is a democracy. We also respectfully ask that you keep it to questions regarding the issue on this debate. We are in an election, and I just hope that respectfully you will listen to what the debaters have to say tonight and respond accordingly. So I think without any further ado, I will throw to our affirmative debater tonight and just let you know that I will be ringing the bell, gentlemen, at the 2-minute mark, and then I will be ringing it again at the 1-minute mark, and I'm going to have to do a four-alarm fire if you continue speaking. So I will, at the end of your 10 minutes and 5 minutes, you will be allowed to finish your sentence, and beyond that, we'll try to keep it there. So, Mr. Holman, over to you.
Thanks so much, Heather. So before I discuss the subject of tonight's debate, I'd like to acknowledge that we are all privileged to speak to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation, upon which has been built the capital of the federal government that is responsible for many of the past and present wrongs against Indigenous peoples in this country. I'd also like to acknowledge the price the planet paid tonight. I traveled from Victoria to Ottawa on an aircraft that created approximately 28,000 kilograms of greenhouse gases, which is the equivalent of driving more than 6 cars for an entire year. So that all being said, I'd like to begin with a story which I believe illustrates the subject of tonight's discussion. In 1996, the Canadian Revenue Agency knew that there was a connection between increasing home prices in Vancouver and the migration of millionaires to that city. But the study showed that connection remained secret until 2016, when whistleblowers leaked portions of it to a journalist with the South China Morning Post. That journalist then filed an access to information request for the full report, but the government didn't respond to that request until 5 years later. And when it did, much of that report was redacted. Canada Revenue Agency has said that delay was unacceptable, but it appeared to have nothing to say about the redactions, nor did it have anything to say about why that report was kept secret for 20 years
a period during which home prices in Vancouver skyrocketed. The result is that Canadians were robbed of the knowledge that they needed to pressure the government about that problem before it became a crisis, just as surely as they are being robbed in today's disastrous housing market. This sordid story isn't just representative of how broken our access to information system is, something that everyone from investigative journalists to opposition members can attest to. It's representative of how that system was built to be broken. Just like its predecessors, the Trudeau government has done little to fix that problem, and our democracy has been weakened as a result. Canada's Access to Information Act was introduced in 1980. Now, this date is important because it's 15 years after Barry Mather became the first MP to introduce a private member's bill that attempted to bring the principles behind the Freedom of Information Act in the United States to Canada. In other words, that's how long the government spent trying to delay and deny the need for such a law. And what were the excuses used to justify that delay and denial? Pretty much the same excuses that are being used today to justify government secrecy. The claim that confidentiality is necessary for good decisions to be made, that honest discussion won't take place if the public can see and hear what's happening. That's why Prime Minister Lester Pearson's cabinet decided in 1967 that government records would have to remain secret for 30 years before being deposited in public archives. They were fearful that Canadians would be able to read about issues that could still be contentious or embarrassing to public men, thereby inhibiting them from expressing themselves frankly in writing. Of course, we have no proof of that except for the say-so of those who have been party to such proceedings and have a vested interest in them, many of whom embarrass themselves on a regular basis in Parliament anyway. Yet, despite that absence of evidence, when the Access to Information Act became law in 1983, it conformed to the contours of the built-in secrecy in our political system rather than challenging them. Indeed, the exemptions and exclusions to openness in the Act are so wide that one reporter at the time declared the Goodyear blimp could float through them without touching either side. And even though there have been repeated calls to tighten those loopholes, successive governments have failed to do so. The result is the government closed almost 150,000 access to information requests in fiscal 2019-20, providing the appearance of transparency. But the most contentious records, the records that would be most valuable to the public, often remain difficult to obtain. In other words, the Access to Information Act is a very Canadian law. It provides the appearance of action without any substance. As a result, Canadians continue to be ignorant of anything discussed in Cabinet, government's top decision-making body. Canadians continue to be ignorant of much of the information public servants provide when advising on those decisions. And Canadians continue to not have enough information to make good decisions in their personal and political lives. Because after all, that's what this whole debate tonight is actually about. Democracy is predicated on the notion that citizens will use truthful information to make rational and empathetic decisions, both the ballot box and the checkout line. But when the government retains the discretionary power to only tell the public what it wants to tell the public about its programs and policies, democracy is thwarted. Take it from someone who has been there. After resigning from cabinet, future Prime Minister John Turner lamented that in politics, there is a vested interest in presenting any policy decision in the most favorable light. This sometimes means selecting the facts. It often means managing or manipulating information. It often involves orchestrating the timing. Full and immediate revelation of all the facts can be embarrassing. Yet, the revelation of such facts is exactly what democracy demands. If we make decisions based on managed or manipulated information, the kind of information that the government regularly disgorges every single day in the form of news releases and canned talking points, we can't arrive at rational or empathetic decisions that reflect reality. And that's particularly hazardous in today's climate of misinformation, disinformation, and severe environmental collapse. In these tumultuous times, the most important need we have is for control and certainty. The promise of freedom of information in a democracy is that knowledge will provide such control and certainty by allowing us to make better decisions about the world around us, explaining the past and predicting the future. But if that promise is broken, as it too often has been in Canada, people will eventually seek out other forms of control and certainty. And that search will lead them to conspiracy theories and authoritarianism, as we are already seeing in this country and abroad. This is what's at stake tonight. This isn't just a debate over whether our Access to Information Act is broken, a legalistic point that is obvious to almost anyone who has used that law in the public interest over the past 38 years. This debate is about whether we will create a participatory democracy that doesn't infantilize Canadians, or do we continue with a paternalistic government that poses more and more of a risk of alienating them every single day? In arguing for freedom of information reform, I know which side of this debate I'm on. And I'm on the side of delivering Canadians a more equal partnership with their supposed representatives. I would hope that, in his response to me, my debating partner will concede that our Access to Information Act is broken, and we can spend the rest of this debate working together to fulfill Canada's promise of democracy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Holman. Under time, I would like to remind everybody that the resolution is, be it resolved that the federal access to information system is broken and requires fundamental reform to meet the public's right to know. Arguing in the negative is Michael Wernick. Mr. Wernick?
Thanks, Heather. Thanks, Sean. Let me also start with an acknowledgement that we are on Algonquin territory, and I want to do a shout out for WFPC, PFC, and acknowledge all the good work you do on behalf of a free press and journalism here and around the world. I concede right away, Sean. I'm not here to defend the status quo. I agree entirely that the access law should be updated and actually considerably renovated. Better is always possible, as someone once said. But I think to get there, we need to have a little less overheated rhetoric about the state of our democracy or the state of the law, and more precision and focus about what specifically needs to be changed. So I'm here tonight to insert a few other ideas into the debate, which will be coming in the Parliament, which we're going to choose on Monday. In case we run out of time, and because some people won't have the patience to watch an entire hour of this debate, I'm going to put all my arguments up front, so you only have to watch the first few minutes. Strong lead, I think you journalists call it. So here's the basic arguments, and I'll come back to them in the exchange to come. One is that there's a core logical fallacy involved in proposing changes to the access rule, that the behaviors would stay the same if you change the rule. No, it won't, and I'll explain why. I think that if you're not careful and you push the boundaries of the law too far, there will be less courage and less candor in deliberations within the government, both within the public service, ministers' offices, and in cabinet. And courage and candor is what we need now more than ever because of the kinds of challenges that you alluded to. The other thing is that the context has changed since 1983 considerably. And Canadian democracy and transparency does not rest on the ATI law, although sometimes that's the kind of rhetoric that's used. The mechanics of a request-based system to get hold of government documents are very important, but there are so many more tools now in 2021 to achieve the same purpose, which is transparency and ultimately accountability. The trend line for the last 30 years has been towards openness. Government is more open than in 1983. I will argue it's more open than it has ever been in our history. There is more institutional oversight of what government does than ever in our history. And our democracy is robust and healthy. Freedom House think tank, NGO, gave Canadian democracy a score this year of 98 out of 100, the highest in the G7. So let's put this in perspective. The frontier of the debate is a desire to learn more about the deliberative processes within government before decisions are made. And I think in some of the proposed remedies would actually harm the patient, and that we have to be very careful about that. I will argue, as a former Secretary to Cabinet, that breaking cabinet government is a really bad idea, and it would make the country less successful and less effective. I'd also argue that helping lawyers, lobbyists, special interest groups, and foreign governments block things that democratically elected governments want to do is not going to lead to a better country. So we have to be very careful about the remedies. Timeliness is compounded by a number of things. One is there are GILNet requests by brokers for every record sent from A to B within a department in a certain time frame. And they tie up the time and energy of the people in the access and privacy shops in the department. There are vexatious and frivolous requests similar to denial of service attacks on websites. We have to acknowledge that and figure out how to deal with them. And this is not a popular topic, but the whole premise rests on a records management system, which is completely underfunded and shambolic. So what we do need is substantial investment in records management and information management within the government, which I can attest is always about the lowest priority. And as we head into another round of budget cuts and spending reviews in the next few years, and they are as inevitable as winter, then I hope that the journalistic community will put up a good fight for records management inside government. There's a slogan for you. There are specific changes that would improve ATI, but I think what the fundamental reform that's required is to take the practices of proactive disclosure, mandatory posting, mandatory release of information, which are currently largely in directives and policies of the government, and entrench them in legislation so there can be no backsliding by the government that we elect on Monday. The logical fallacy is you propose a change in rules and apply it to old behavior. A good example is the zealots for proportional representation, who always argue if we had PR, this is what would have happened in the last election. Well, no. As soon as you change the rules, you change the incentives. If we had proportional representation, parties would campaign differently, they would invest resources differently, voters would perceive their choices differently, funding of campaigns would alter, and the outcomes would change, and there would be a clear incentive for splintering of parties. Look at the election ballot in Germany, and the election that's coming next week. So another example of how the rules matter, or the expectations matter, should be very familiar to journalists. You understand the difference between an on-the-record and an off-the-record conversation. You understand what attribution does to the candor and courage of the source that you're talking to. Why do you think public servants and political staffers would respond any differently? And I can say, if you know that somebody's recording a conversation with you, you might choose different words. So the same thing with ATI. If the premise is that by pushing the frontiers of the act out, you would get access to the same kinds of advice and conversations, no, you won't. The nature of the conversations would change, new behaviors would emerge, people would learn how to game the system, both inside and out. So I think you have to be clear on the intended and unintended consequences. So I think advice would become safer, language more oblique, records would be bland and safe, conversations would migrate elsewhere. In Washington, it's the lawyer in the room is the note taker, and they hide behind solicitor-client privilege. People will move to encrypted apps. They will have face-to-face meetings instead of putting things in emails and texts. And you would open more public servants to harassment and doxing because of the advice that they give would be out on the public record. For me, the most important thing is cabinet government, and I do want to touch on that. And I argue strongly, and you can read about this in my book, cabinet solidarity and cabinet confidence go hand in hand. They're inextricably tied. Parliamentary government is not a municipal council, and making it like a municipal council would not be an upgrade for the country. If I can quote the Supreme Court of Canada, who are objective on this, the 2014 Babcock decision of the Supreme Court of Canada ruling on an access case, the process of democratic governance works best when cabinet members charged with government policy and decision-making are free to express themselves around the cabinet table unreservedly. Ironically, one of the major counterpoints and counterweights to prime ministerial power inside a cabinet is that cabinet ministers can speak freely. There is, if they knew that they were speaking for the record, they would play to the record, they would pull their punches, the real discussions, just like most municipal councils, would move outside to the lobbies. And in fact, you would make it easier for lobbyists, lawyers, and stakeholders to block governments from taking courageous decisions. If the end purpose of all of this is accountability and transparency, ATI sits next to proactive disclosure, active oversight by an increased number of watchdogs, recourse to the courts by citizens, disclosure to the courts and discovery of litigation, whistleblower legislation, answerability to parliament and committees, and hundreds of written questions in Parliament. Canadian government is more open than 1983. It's more open than it was 10 years ago. The fence post clauses that draw a boundary around the Access to Information Act are not a shrinking of that space. They are simply a fence post, and maybe we could talk about that later. When the government sets up a new entity to review sexual harassment complaints in the military, there will be a fence post clause to ensure that that process is confidential for the complainant. That is not a shrinking of the transparency space. It's a protection for confidentiality where it's needed. In a world of digital government and data-driven government, the Directive on Open Government, the release of over 30,000 data sets is really important. I hope that everybody watching has bookmarked open.canada.ca and everybody has bookmarked the GC Infobase. How are we doing? Open Data Watch gave Canada a score of 15th out of 187 countries that it watched, and the Open Data Barometer from Tim Werner's foundation placed Canada second in the world. Those practices should be entrenched in legislation. There should be more mandatory disclosure, mandatory posting, and mandatory release. But in a country with 87% of people have smartphones and 94% have access to the internet, citizens have more access to more information than any time in Canadian history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wernick. We're now moving into the rebuttal portion of the debate. Mr. Holman, you have 5 minutes for a rebuttal.
So I would like to begin, because I think it's important on the points that we agree with, Michael. I do agree that with you that there is a need for reform of the Access to Information Act. I'm glad that this is something that we share. And I am also a supporter of proactive disclosure of information and more proactive disclosure of information. I think we need more of that, not less. And I think the unfortunate thing is that much of the information that we currently have available through those open data portals is often really useless to a lot of journalists. And I think if you go in newsrooms around the country, you'll find that in a lot of cases there's complaints about what is not there as opposed to what exactly is there. But I do want to address head-on this idea that you've put forward that there will be a reduction in courage and candor if there is more openness, if we have a more rigorous freedom of information system. Because certainly that particular argument has been made many times in the past. It was certainly an argument that was made when the Access to Information Act was originally being introduced. This idea that you would have this lack of frank and free conversations within the corridors of power. But what we do know is that there are actually governments around the world, including governments here in Canada, that have much more open systems and don't really seem to struggle that much in terms of good governance. You mentioned the fact that there are local governments around this country, and they certainly are far more open than the federal government is, and in some cases larger than provinces, which use the same system of government that is at the federal level. And we see at those local levels, bureaucrats providing advice to council in the open, entirely in the open, to the public, and that doesn't really seem to compromise their ability to make decisions. In addition, I'll also point to the example of New Zealand. New Zealand regularly posts publicly the minutes and agendas of its cabinet meetings. That's something that's part of their government. And I think we could hopefully both agree that they seem to have managed the recent pandemic quite well, and probably better than Canada has. So I do think we have these examples in other places, both in Canada and around the world, where there is greater openness, where there is more transparency, where the public really does have an opportunity to see the to and fro that happens both between elected officials and unelected officials. And I do understand that you're a supporter of cabinet government, but I really do think that we need to sort of take a bit more of a modern view of that. As you know, cabinet government has been around for a very long time. The Privy Council is an artifact, and its secrecy is an artifact of going back all the way to the Renaissance and medieval times. Maybe there's a better way to do things than that. It seems ridiculous that in this day and age, the top decision-making body in government, Canadians cannot have any access to, cannot have any kind of information about. That just doesn't seem to be good democracy, especially when, thanks to party discipline, all of the decisions that are made within that space become fiat under a majority government. So I would encourage you to perhaps consider whether or not cabinet government is exactly working in the best interest of democracy right now, and whether or not we could perhaps develop something better.
Okay, sorry, there was time left on the clock.
No?
So
I'm not going to run the clock.
Yeah, that's fine.
I'm going to count on you to do the same thing.
Thanks. So I would just say that everybody would know in most other walks of life that the candor and courage of the conversations is affected by whether other people are listening. And the cabinet process relies on solidarity, candor within the room, and then people come together on a decision. Municipal governments are often captured by lobbyists, stakeholders, real estate developers. It's not a better model than the one we have. I think that one of the things that happens inside the caucus meetings and inside cabinet meetings is that people challenge each other. It isn't fiat from the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister's office. I have seen Prime Ministers talked out of things they wanted to do and talked into things they didn't want to do by their colleagues, and I'm not sure those conversations would happen if they were in the open forum of a municipal council. I just want to go back to proactive disclosure and the reliance on journalists as the interpreter of what Canadians need to know. If you go to convenient internet sites available to all Canadians, you can get most of the outputs and intermediate products of government, all the executive orders, all the contracts, all the procurement opportunities, all the job opportunities, all the executive branch appointments, all the vacancies that are upcoming, all the collective agreements, all the grants and contributions, all the travel by public office holders, all the hospitality, all the contacts by registered lobbyists, all the public opinion research, all of the internal policies and software that makes the government work. And you can even go tonight and look at the transition briefings that departments provided after the last election. So citizens have access to an enormous amount of information. The truth is that a lot of access requests are not noble requests by journalists. They're made by stakeholders, lobbyists, and lawyers on behalf of private interest. And sorting out where we can protect the public interest in the public treasury is the task that's required in drafting specific amendments. I agree with a number of things, that could be done. I would be very comfortable shortening the period for disclosure of cabinet records. I'm not sure that that what the New Zealand government posts is an authentic version of the conversation that took place. I'm sure it's probably a very managed release of the minutes, but we could certainly do that. In terms of amendments, the boundary between advice and analysis and options is a real issue. I absolutely agree with that. And a much more precise definition of what is advice could be drafted and developed. I reached an agreement with Michael Ferguson, the late Auditor General, which narrowed the boundaries of advice and made much more information available to him. And I think Canadians can have confidence sometimes in the institutional watchdogs having access to things. That cabinet conferences and documents are made available to the Auditor General. They are made available to other offices of Parliament. They're made available to courts. I released an enormous amount of information to a trial judge and let the trial judge decide what's relevant to the trial. So not everything has to flow through journalists. They're an important part of the equation, but not the only one. And I think that we should be strengthening the institutional oversight. But there are now quite a list. The Auditor General, the Official Languages Commissioner, the Information Commissioner, the Privacy Commissioner, the Conflict Commissioner, the Lobbying Commissioner, the Whistleblower Commissioner, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, the Accessibility Commissioner, the Procurement Ombudsman, the Public Service Commission, the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the Intelligence Commissioner, and we're about to create some more. These people have budgets in excess of $200 million and over 1,500 people working for them. Imagine a few newsrooms could do with a little bit of budget like that. Those are institutional oversight and transparency mechanisms with rigorous methodologies and safeguards. And I think that strengthening the link to the institutional watchdogs is something that the next legislation could pursue.
Thank you, Mr. Wernick. Mr. Holman, 5 minutes and no new evidence, please.
Thank you. I did want to address what seems to be the main argument that you're making in favor of cabinet government as opposed to a more open system of government, such as the one that we see at local governments around the country. Your argument is that they're subjected to lobbyist capture. I can say confidently that most people who have covered the federal government or the provincial government would see significant amounts of influence by lobbyists over various different ministries, and I directly reported on that when it comes to natural resource issues and the influence that oil and gas companies, forestry companies, and mining companies have over public policy in this country. So I do wonder whether that really is an actual advantage of having cabinet government when we see so much influence behind the scenes from lobbyists. And indeed, when I was a reporter, what I can tell you is that oftentimes the best information I would usually get was from lobbyists who civil servants, ironically, were far more willing to talk to than they were willing to talk to reporters, which seems odd since reporters are more directly the servants of the public. But I was happy to hear that, that you are interested in making freedom of information requests more timely. I think that's something important. And I would encourage us to think about the fact that when it comes to timeliness, one of the ways that we can actually reduce the amount of time that freedom of information requests take to go through the system is reducing the number of exemptions and exclusions. We currently have basically a blackout bureaucracy that's in charge of saying what can't come out of the government as opposed to what can come out of the government. And I think a really helpful way of increasing the speed of our freedom of information system would be to simply, as I argued initially, reduce those exemptions and exclusions so we do have more openness, an open by default government, as it were. And finally, I also did want to just address the issue of the trend towards openness that you've talked about and the availability of all of these public records that you're saying exists. I have a small anecdotal example. Every year, I provided my journalism class of second-year students with an assignment to take a look through Statistics Canada's records and find story ideas in those data sets that were available to the public. And I've been doing this exercise, I would say, for about 9 years or so. And Over the course of those 9 years, we've actually run out of original story ideas to find in the statistics that are released by Statistics Canada. It seems odd that if there is so much information available from the federal government that a second-year journalism class of 20 students would be able to exhaust all of the information that is available. And indeed, most reporters who deal with cross-border issues and report on the American government will tell you that there is a greater degree of availability of public records in the United States than exists in Canada. So I think we do need help on that front. We do need more proactive disclosure, and I'm very encouraged to hear you as an advocate of that.
So I'm very disappointed in your students. I could generate 50 story ideas anytime if people want to contact me of what's available in all of those reports and policies. They're just not interesting to journalists sometimes when they're running unpacks on the story of the day. But I do think that what we do, we can replace a lot of the exemption-based, request-based model with mandatory disclosure and release of various kinds of records and information to the public, strengthening what Parliament is given and strengthening what the institutional watchdogs are given as a chance to do that. There are complementary things that would be helpful. I agree with Transparency International that we need a better definition of beneficial ownership of private corporations. I do think that we should take the science publishing protocol that was developed in a collective agreement with government scientists and entrench that in legislation so the next government can't backslide. That the Australian law on foreign interference is a necessary part of that. And I don't think that we should go into the debate in the next Parliament just being vague about an overhaul. If there's an exemption, then propose which ones go. But advice is a thing. National security is a thing. We have hostile actors out there. The idea of giving non-Canadians access to this mechanism is naive and dangerous in the world we live in today. Be very clear about which exemptions you would narrow and how. I'd be happy to help with the drafting exercise, and I think we can come out with a 2021, 2022 version of a request-based model that will sit side by side with proactive disclosure and institutional oversight and help restore and strengthen the trust that Canadians should have that we do still have a very healthy, open democracy in Canada. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Holman. Well, I think that that ends the debate. We are ahead of time, which I'm sure the audience will appreciate. Thank you very much for that very substantive and informative exchange. I hope people are feeling enlightened about this. Again, the resolution is, be it resolved, the federal access to information system is broken and requires fundamental reform to meet the public's right to know. Now the fun part of the debate, you in the audience get to vote and decide who convinced you to either shift to one side or the other. While we're doing that, I would also like to acknowledge the land that we're on. Here at iPolitics, we're the media partner for today's event for World Press Freedom Canada. We are located 2 blocks away from Parliament Hill, just downstream from one of the most sacred places for Indigenous people. We are on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin people. The Anishinaabe have been protecting this land for thousands of years. So I would like to again thank the Algonquin people for letting us share this land, miigwech. So you've had a bit of time to take the poll results. Devin, I don't know if we have anything coming in here. Should we go to the audience Q&A? Mohammed? Okay, we're still waiting for the results to come in. What I'd also ask everybody to do who's been watching the debate, please feel free to send in a question. I would like to remind you that this is an issues debate on access to information. And if you heard anything in this debate that you would like to ask about, now is your opportunity to do it. It's not every day you get to be in the room with Michael Wernick and Sean Holman. So feel free to send those in. If you could keep them on point, we'd greatly appreciate it. So we've got some poll results. Are you for or against the resolution that the federal access to information system is broken and requires fundamental reform to meet the public's right to know? Well, we see tonight that 80% of the people are for the resolution. I would go to the second question and see if anybody has changed their mind. So if the audience is in favor of access to information, that's terrific. That's what we advocate for at World Press Freedom Canada, but we also understand the need to understand what that means and how it affects our democracy. Do we have any poll answers to the second question? Did either of the debaters change your mind? Well, I have to say, that's interesting. It was a tie a minute ago. People are changing their minds as they do the poll. But more or less.
Not a big sample.
Okay, so for the most part, people came in and they did not have their minds changed. This reminds me of the polling for the election, I've got to say. It's been a pretty raucous 30 days. So it's evenly spaced. So I would say that this debate has ended in a tie in terms of persuasiveness, which is the key to a debate. Number 3, do we have any answers to number 3 in the polling questions? Oh, people are still changing their mind on number 2. I would like to say that we did have 3 questions submitted by our audience. We're very appreciative of these questions. They were specific to political situations that are not something that we'd be willing to delve into in this debate. It didn't really speak to the issue. So again, I would invite anyone, if you have an issue, issue-related question, the overarching need for access to information, what you've heard tonight, was there any tension in that debate that leads you to being curious about how something could be resolved? I think we had a pretty clean case for and against. I would ask people to send those in. If you have any questions, let us know. We have 1 answer on the poll, and then I'll take an audience question from the audience. So number 3, do we have the polling answer? That's it. Okay, so we're all done with the poll. We'll have that online. Be sure to go to the World Press Freedom Canada website and check the poll results. You can also share the link for tonight's event. We're going to be posting that video live. Do we have any questions from the audience? Any questions? 1 question.
Can I take my mask off?
Yes, you can. Coming up, Dean, because you're going to be doing the closing remarks. So full disclosure, so Dean has a question, I'm not surprised. He has been an access to information guru in Canada for his career as a journalist, formerly at CBC, former colleague, and now you are independent and free of everything, I guess, are you?
I can say whatever I want now.
And a director on World Press Freedom Canada. So I'm going to hand it over to you now, Dean, and you can also deliver closing remarks.
Okay, this has been terrific. I've heard some really interesting arguments on both sides, and I've learned a lot. One of the things, as a Canadian, I'm looking for a compromise here, and what I hear you say, Mr. Wernick, is that the amount of time that cabinet confidences are kept off the table, which is currently 20 years under the Act, may be too long. So I'd like to hear you talk about what isn't too long, what is an appropriate amount of time to keep cabinet records secret. And the second part of that is, as a journalist, I was very frustrated because the access to information officials in PCO, in Privy Council office, would stamp something cabinet confidence, and there was no way to challenge them on that because the Information Commissioner of Canada has no authority to review that decision. Do you think she should have that authority to review cabinet confidence decisions?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think if you're going to argue to modify cabinet government fundamentally, then make that argument, and that can be had out. But in the confines of access to information reform, I think it is possible to greatly narrow the core space of current deliberations about current issues and have a bit of an antidote against blocking coalitions trying to stop a government from taking tough decisions. I have no problem with release of documents around 10 years. I mean, that with the shelf life of governments in Canada now, that would take you back 2 prime ministers, 3 elections. I think the 20-year rule was conceived of at a time when governments lasted longer. I have no problem with that. I would help, have a much narrower definition of advice. I do know that the advice to ministers was interpreted too broadly, and I don't have any problem with a lot of the underlying analysis and options and studies and considerations and costings and legal things being available. But at the end of the day, there are moments where you just need the candor to talk to a minister about, you could go this way or go this way, you're going to make people unhappy, either way, these are some of the things. And I think on the political side, they have the same issues. And I just fundamentally believe that you would have less candor and courage inside the cabinet room if you didn't have that kind of space, at least for a period of time before people start gaming the system. So yeah, I do think there is a way to narrow that. I also think just because it's not going to you as a reporter doesn't mean it's not available to people. It may be available to the Auditor General or an Officer of Parliament or to discovery in court and so on. There's a way to take the Evidence Act definitions and be more precise about them. My general mantra is stay away from generalities and vague sort of rhetoric about grand solutions, and draft very precise, this is what we're going to do now. I'd say the same thing about Indigenous issues, but that's probably for another day.
That's another debate. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for listening in on the web and for showing up here. Our sponsors, we are so grateful for. First of all, iPolitics for providing this beautiful space and all of the technical help and equipment. The Canadian Commission for UNESCO for their support, Canadian Bankers Association, and of course all of the great volunteers who are members of World Press Freedom Canada, including Heather, our moderator. And thank you, our two debaters. It was a terrific night. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And remember to vote next Monday. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Take care.